On to today's program. Well, the Cold War has ended. We have that word officially now from both sides in the contest. The Soviet Empire lies in economic ruin, at least partly because American presidents from Kennedy to Reagan waged a largely peaceful, but not always, game of armaments chicken with the Soviet Union, matching high-cost missile for outrageously expensive aircraft carrier one for one until the Soviets ate themselves up from within, and we, with trillions of dollars in debt and our own economy dangerously weakened, were declared the winners. What comes now? A peace dividend and renewal of America's economic health? Or maybe jolting displacement as industries that once supplied the nuclear submarines and B-1 bombers to our military become no longer needed? Is the New World Order a matrix for economic opportunity or for disaster in the United States? Marion Anderson, our speaker today, is the Director of Employment Research Associates of Lansing, Michigan. She has written and spoken extensively on the effect of the defense budget and specific military expenditures on segments of the American economy and on the economy in general. Her expertise in a timely and provocative subject area has brought Ms. Anderson to Portland to teach a seminar at Lewis and Clark College. And City Club is proud today to welcome to its podium to speak on demilitarizing the American economy, Ms. Marion Anderson.
Is the mic okay for me? Yes? No? People here? Great. Okay. It's always a great pleasure to come to Portland. It's one absolutely, one of my 2 or 3 favorite American cities. So whenever I get a speaking engagement here, I sort of put aside anything else I have to do and come on out. I really like it. I like the people. I like the city. Occasionally, I even see the sun. I've been known to see it once or twice. And in the morning, I saw a beautiful sunrise over the mountain while having my breakfast. What I want to talk to you all about today, before I talk about demilitarizing the American economy, is how we got in the mess we are in. It didn't happen by accident, and it happened over a half a century, which is a long time in the history of our nation. Fundamentally, what happened was, during the Second World War, a substantial number of U.S. corporations learned during the war that cost-plus contracting was the gravy train to end all gravy trains. Because unlike many of you in this audience and myself as director of a small independent economic consulting firm who has to meet payrolls which are not based on cost-plus contracting, the military contractors, the corporations engaged in military contracting learned that with cost-plus contracting, their risk disappeared and their profits went up. What better life for a business person, you say. That's true, but it has nothing virtually to do with the free enterprise system as we know it and discuss it in this country. So when the war was over and some of these firms had to go back to civilian enterprise, they decided they didn't like that nearly as much as the military contracting for the reasons I had just mentioned, and became active promoters of a large, permanent, stable military presence in the U.S. economy. In 1948, the National Security Council, which is an unelected group of advisors to the American president, met and made a decision, an economic decision unprecedented in American history. They decided that 10% of the gross national product from then on into the indefinite future should be spent on the military. Nobody in American history has ever made such a decision. No group of personnel, either elected or unelected, has ever decided that an actual percentage of the GNP was going to go to anything. Now, when the NSC people and the leading members of the House and Senate were discussing this with President Truman, Senator Arthur Vandenberg said to the president, "Mr. President, the only way you can get that much money out of the American public is to scare the hell out of them." And that is, of course, what has continued to be done right up until the last year or so. Now, the results of this decision to spend this much money on the military has been to build up an enormous and very entrenched military-industrial complex, ranging from the 2 million people in the uniformed armed forces, 1 million people in the non-uniformed armed forces, in other words, civilian personnel, up to over 3 million people working directly in military industry, and then all the people that have, grants in universities and contracts and so forth. So it's been a very widespread group of individuals, of communities, states, and regions that have been very caught up in this. Some years ago, when I was in Washington, walking up and down the halls of Congress, talking to members of the House and of the Senate about the military budget and what it was doing to the economy, and I would very frequently discuss a specific weapon system. In other words, we didn't need this bomber or that submarine or whatever. And over again, the response I would get from the member of Congress would be, yes, Marion, I know we don't need it. I know it's gold-plated, but the jobs. And in their mind, their statement, but the jobs, terminated the discussion. Because what they were simply saying to me was, the military budget was a great big public works program, and they didn't care whether the stuff worked or whether it was needed. It simply was a big job creator. Now, at that time, I had not been engaged in economic research on this subject. So although I felt personally kind of uncomfortable with the argument, I really had no rebuttal. Then some years later, after I moved to Michigan and was sitting in bed one freezing February morning, quite unlike your lovely weather here, where it was snowing, sleeting, and raining all at the same time, and I was reading a friend of mine's book named Seymour Melman. Seymour Melman is one of the world's leading experts on conversion. And in this book was a regression analysis showing what happened to every major sector of the economy as the military budget moved up or down. And what this economist, professor at Yale named Bruce Russett, had found was that every time the military budget moved up, every major sector of the economy suffered in varying degrees. Durable goods production, non-durable goods production, state and local government, services, and construction all suffered. After I had read that, I got very excited, because then I decided that if Bruce Russett could determine the percentage by which each of these areas of the economy suffered, it would just be a question of time and effort until I could turn that into jobs never created. So I worked first on a report which just showed the effect on the state of Michigan, and that got so much press and so much excitement and so much interest that I then talked the board I was working for at that time into allowing me to do a study on the entire U.S. economy. And in 1975, the first edition of The Empty Pork Barrel, Unemployment, and the Pentagon Budget came out. What we found at that time was that every time the military budget went up $1 billion, 10,000 jobs disappeared in the United States. This caused a great deal of excitement. The military budget at that time was costing the U.S. economy just under 900,000 jobs a year. And the reason the report caused so much excitement is it undermined a central argument of the keeping these enormous military budgets going, which was that it generates jobs and therefore is good for the economy. What we said in The Empty Pork Barrel is, yes, of course military spending generates jobs. If you're going to spend, $100 billion on anything, you're going to get jobs. You can even, burn up all the money and you're still going to get jobs from the people on the printing presses. But the question was, when compared to spending the money in the civilian economy, what happened? And what happened was disastrous. And it has continued to be disastrous. At this point in U.S. history, 75% of the American public live in states and regions that suffer a net loss of income and jobs every time the military budget goes up. So if you want to know why certain areas of the country, such as Southern California, certain places in Texas, and so forth, have flourished during especially the big Reagan-Bush military buildup, and why others have suffered, and your state obviously being preeminent among them, this is why. The reason is very straightforward. If the government takes money via the tax system out of your pockets, yours and everybody else's, you don't have the money to spend on normal civilian economic activity. The state and local governments also have less money to spend. And the money is then concentrated in certain areas of the country which have very large military contracts or military bases. Now, military spending is deleterious to the overall economy, not just because of the flow of funds shift via the tax system into bases and contracts, but because of who it hires in the economy. The military has hired over the years, the military and its contractors have hired over the years between 28 and 38% of U.S. scientists and engineers. About 2 years ago, the president of Sony was meeting with the president of GE, and this is what the president of Sony said. He said, and I quote, "Your best engineers are better than our best engineers. But your best engineers work for the military, and our best engineers work for me." It is not the same if you hire 100,000 people who would have otherwise been, so to speak, digging ditches, or if you hire 100,000 of the brightest engineers and scientists in the country. One of the problems with the kind of sort of macroeconomic research that we do is that simply a job equals a job. My father, when he was alive, was one of the best-known biochemists in the world, and Dad's work literally meant that millions upon millions of children are better nourished, and for some of them are literally alive because of the work on protein, especially milk protein, that he did. So it's, you know, you can say it's just a job, but there aren't a lot of people to replace the best scientists and engineers we have. So if they are concentrated, for instance, in some of the big national labs, doing, figuring out how a missile can get 10 feet closer to a target, it means they are not producing civilian goods, they are not figuring out alternative forms of energy, they are not working out how to build cheaper, high-quality housing, and all the things that this country, in fact, a lot of the world, desperately need. So it is a qualitative difference in the society when that many of the top technical and scientific talent are siphoned off, not just for years, but decade after decade, and at this point we can say just about for 50 years. Now, I began Employment Research Associates in 1978 because it was clear that there was a dire need out there for hard data on a sustained basis of what high levels of military spending do to the U.S. economy. I should like you all to take your copy of Converting the American Economy and open it to page 1. Now, this is a report that we completed immediately prior to the disintegration of the USSR, but I think that, but I have very little question that the basic numbers we came up with still stand. It doesn't really make any difference. At the bottom of page 1, under economic effects, what we did, and I'm sure most of you all are familiar with econometric models, we did a very detailed analysis of the military budget, where the money was being spent on, you know, fighter aircraft, on, you know, aircraft carriers, on salaries to troops and so forth. And we broke that all down by individual industry. So in other words, you can't put into an economic model fighter aircraft, but you have to find out all the components that go into the aircraft, what it does to aluminum production, how much it means in terms of purchasing computers, how much it means for steel, and so forth and so forth. And then the same thing on the civilian side of the ledger. For education, if you're putting money into education, how much of it goes into actually physically building the school, how much goes to hiring teachers, how much goes to hiring librarians and maintenance personnel, and so forth. So in order to do this report at the level of detail that we did a very elaborate analysis of all the contracting, both military and civilian, that took place. Converting the American economy is a study showing what would happen if we took an annual average of $70 billion a year, basically starting with $35 billion in 1991 and going up to a little over $100 billion in 1994, out of the military budget and shifted it into the civilian economy, specifically into education, infrastructure, social and health services, housing, and employment and training. And what we found when we did that shift, that there would be 1,688,000 fewer jobs due to the military cuts, but 2,165,000 more jobs because of the civilian spending increase, for a net annual gain of just under 500,000 jobs, 477,000 jobs. You get, in this analysis, you get 24,000 jobs for every $1 billion cut from military expenditure, but about 31,000 jobs for every $1 billion spent on civilian expenditure. And after this report had been completed, I simply did a series of separate computer runs on various areas, and to find out how many jobs, for instance, you get if you spend $1 billion in education. It's 41,000 jobs. If you spend it on healthcare, 40,000 jobs, and so forth. Mass transit and housing are both a little over one's 30,000, the other's 35,000 jobs. As a matter of fact, what we found, and this started to show up in the early 80s, because we've been doing these analyses now for some years, is that if you really want to stimulate the economy in this country, when Jack Kennedy reduced taxes, it did stimulate the economy in the early 60s. And the reason it stimulated the economy in the early 60s is virtually everything Americans bought was made in America. At this point, Americans are spending so much money buying foreign goods that if you want to stimulate the economy, the best thing is not to cut taxes. The best thing to do is to give the money to state and local governments for state and local government expenditures, because that way, if you're giving the money to the city of Portland is going to do something about the streets and the sewage facilities and the educational system right here in Portland, and most of the people they're hiring are here in Portland, or at least from Oregon. They're not, putting more people to work in Yokohama. And so that is, at this point, I think if for a sound economic policy, I can simply say that is, in point of fact, what happens. Now, we found then is for every $1 billion shifted from military to civilian expenditure, you have a net gain of just under 7,000 jobs. You also have a rise in the GNP with this $70 billion annual shift of $17.5 billion. Net annual investment would go up over $3 billion, and personal income would go up over $10 billion. If you want to turn to pages 2 and 3, on page 2, you see at the top, at the table, projected Pentagon outlays under Mr. Cheney's projections, 1991 through 1994, starting at $292 billion and rising to $302 billion. And this is ridiculous. There's no Soviet Union. So what in the world are they going to spend almost $300 billion on it? They're now talking about very, very modest declines, very, very modest declines. Employment Research Associates is suggesting, as you can see with the savings at the bottom, starting at $35 billion in 1991 and rising to $104 billion, which would bring the military spending down to about $200 billion. And as you can see on the top of page 3, where we suggest spending the money: education, infrastructure, the environment, housing, and so forth. Now, I think it's important for you all to know, since a lot of you are in business or concerned with people in business, if you would turn to page 27 to see precisely what happens from an industrial point of view when money is shifted out of the military and put into the civilian economy. And as you can see, the very first industry mentioned here is the lumber industry. There would be 4,850 fewer jobs with jobs lost from military spending cuts, 16,100 more jobs with civilian spending increases, for a net job gain of well over 11,000 jobs. And for those of you interested in education, if you want to go down to the third to the bottom, on that same column, you see education, public and private, a net gain of about 150,000 jobs. Now, the largest number of jobs lost are, as you can see in the other column, uniform military personnel, almost 500,000 jobs, and non-uniform military personnel, almost 200,000 jobs. As a matter of fact, according to today's paper, even Sam Nunn is talking about military personnel cuts of about 500,000. So obviously our figures are extremely close here. The largest number of jobs lost because of the military spending cuts are in rest of transportation equipment, missiles, aircraft, ships, tanks, and so forth. I've never been sure why a missile is a transportation equipment, but in any case, that's what it is. All right. On page 29, you will see the occupational impact of these alternative priorities. So I'm sure all of you would be interested to look up your own occupation and find out what would happen under military spending cuts and civilian spending increases. Now, it is very important to think through in all of this because we're obviously talking about major political and economic decision making if you're talking about this type of very, very large shift within an economy. I would like to suggest to you that our economy, and in fact our nation as a whole, is now at a major crossroads in time. Professor Paul Kennedy of Yale, a heretofore not that well-known historian, but he wrote a book which came out a couple of years ago called The Decline of the Great Powers. It was widely written up with people either saying this was absolutely true and we better pay attention, to especially people on the far right becoming absolutely hysterical saying, no, I am not a declinist like Paul Kennedy. But actually what Paul Kennedy does was point out the choices that nations make. And this is fundamentally what has happened to other big empires in the past. They kind of get their act together and become extremely productive. And this, I'm talking about starting, the times of the Greeks and Romans all the way up through the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, and so forth. And they start on a rising curve. They become wealthier and wealthier, and their markets spread out. And then they start to build up their military in order to protect their markets or to keep internal peace or to keep other people out or whatever. Anyway, build up their military. At a certain point, the military, since military spending is, from an economic point of view, completely parasitic, the military spending takes away so much from the productive base of the country that the productive base is at a point of beginning to decline. That's when the crossroads point is reached, when the military has built up and the economy has built up and the military has also built up a lot and gotten big and very expensive. That's the point of choice. If the country at that point decides to continue the large military expenditures, very frequently big operations outside their own nation and so forth, then the economic decline becomes very precipitous. It just goes like that, down very rapidly, because it does not any longer have the base, the fundamental base with which to sustain it. If, on the other hand, they decide not to scale back the military, they may be less of an empire, but they can also have a very strong and viable nation. That is the point we are at today. So we are really at a crossroads time in American history now. We are seeing, with the enormous buildup of debt, both from the balance of payments problems and the unprecedented deficit on the part of the federal government, that major cuts in the military have to be made. And I would submit to you, $5–10 billion a year, that's throwaway money, that's small change, it means nothing. The military budget has got to go down big time. It really should go down by 50% within the next 5 to 7 years. Now, one of the reasons we did converting the American economy the way we did is it is not enough just to say we want to spend less money on the military and throw all those guys out in the street. It doesn't make any difference how long they've been working and living there and so forth. And you mean, no matter what your feeling is about military spending, a great many of the people working in the factories and in the armed forces feel they have done and are doing their patriotic duty. It is a job, but they also feel it was the right job and it's what they should have been doing. So I never like it if people, kind of denigrate these people. It is not right. The country asked them to do that. We put a lot of our money into it, or incredible amounts of our money into it, and it's not right to just throw those people on the street. So what you need to do, I think, are two things in tandem. The first is you have to present an alternative agenda. The U.S. public and the next president of the United States has to decide, I'm getting a smile, right? Has to decide what kind of country we want. If we want to continue this very rapid division into classes of a relatively small number of very rich people, a relatively large number of very poor people, and an increasingly squeezed and anxiety-ridden and smaller middle class, we can continue the route we're on. If we want to reverse our current situation and start again manufacturing a large number of the high value-added products which really make a country productive and rich and a rising standard of living, we then have to massively redirect the resources which have been going to the military into the civilian economy. First and foremost, we have got to rebuild the infrastructure of the United States. We used to spend well over 2% a year of our GNP on infrastructure. We're now spending under 1.1%. Japan, I think, spends 2.6 or 2.8%, as does Germany and other very productive nations. David Alan Ashour, a brilliant economist with the Chicago Fed, did a series of seminal studies in which he showed an extremely close correlation between expenditures on infrastructure and productivity. I mean, literally the two went up together in tandem and came down together in tandem. So for all the economists that you see moaning and groaning and tearing their hair and saying, well, we just don't understand why there's been this lack of productivity growth during the 80s, Ashour says, here it is. And it's true. What we have got to do is we have got to rebuild the roads, the bridges, the railroads, the sewage treatment facilities of this country. Now, when that happens, the states like Oregon, like Michigan, like Ohio, Pennsylvania, and all of the other states that are big civilian producers will start doing very well. I would like you all to take Bankrupting American Cities and open it to page 7. In Bankrupting American Cities, we did an analysis showing, this is basically a fiscal analysis showing, as you can see in the first column, all of the military expenditures in a state and in a metropolitan area in millions, the Pentagon tax burden, and the net tax gain or loss. As you can see in Oregon, $778.3 million were spent in the state in FY 1990. Your tax burden by the Pentagon was $3,152.4 million, for a net loss to the state of $2,374 million. Now, I had asked a little research be done when I got to the state yesterday as to what is your state's annual budget. Your annual budget seems to be just about $2.7 billion. So you can see there is an extraordinarily close correlation between the total net loss of the Pentagon to the Pentagon from Oregon every year and your entire state's budget. To put it slightly differently, if the Pentagon was only taking out 50% of what it's done, I mean, you still have a big net loss, okay, but not as big. So if your net loss went down, say, from $2.4 billion a year to half that, your state budget could be increased by 50%, and you wouldn't have any bigger tax burden on the state. You might even be able to do a lot of the things you want to do. A 50% state increase is pretty dramatic. Governors become ecstatic with even 10%, even 5%. As a matter of fact, now governors are happy if they don't have to make big cuts. So as you can see, we're talking about very big money. Here in the Portland metropolitan area, you're suffering a net loss of $1,240 million a year, or $3,300 per family. Now, in converting the economy, what has got to get done is an entire new set of priorities have got to get laid out there. I mentioned, first of all, rebuilding the physical infrastructure of the country. Another term is rebuilding the human infrastructure. I personally hate the term, but I still don't know precisely what I can use, to replace it. The human infrastructure obviously would be major resources going into the educational system, into housing, social services, health care, in other words, doing what is needed for the people of the United States. When you do that, when you start really rebuilding not just the physical infrastructure, but the social and human infrastructure of this country, you will have a dramatically different nation. I mean, one of the interesting and I think sorrowful things to think about is to what degree the spirit of a country changes if the constant preoccupation decade after decade is war. I mean, look at the amount of time we've been at war. We had the Second World War in 1941 through 1945. And then a few years later, we had a Korea. And then a few years after that, we had Vietnam. And that wasn't over till, 73, 74, that it was like really over. And all the intervening periods, we have had the Cold War. So we have brought up now generations of students in which we have said to them in one way or another, the main thing the federal government does is prepare for and make war. I mean, you are all here in the City Club because you want to take leadership or do take leadership in your community. The federal government also takes leadership. And what the federal government has taken leadership in is making war. That has been, in fact, its major occupation and preoccupation. When the mayors of our cities, and I've done work for the U.S. Conference of Mayors, have come to Washington and said, our cities are disintegrating. The homelessness is ridiculous. You know, we have drug abuse, we have terrible crime, on and on. I mean, everybody who lives in an American city can recite the litany. What they were always told was, it's too bad, like, don't talk to us, go away, don't bother us, solve your own problems. We gotta build up the military, national security, you know. In fact, when I was testifying before the House Armed Services Committee at one point, I was literally told by a member of that committee, the only thing the federal government should do is the Pentagon. There shouldn't be any social security system. No money should go to education. No money to the environment. The states and localities can do all that. The only thing the federal government should do is give money to the military. Now, if we want to do serious conversion, we should, on the one hand, have a major agenda out there of needs that have to get filled, some of which I have just mentioned. I'm sure everybody in this room can come up with their own set, which they feel passionately about and which are doubtlessly needed to be done. The other thing is that both the base communities, the communities around military bases, and the people who work on military contracts have got to start advanced planning for the day the cuts would come. In other words, this should be management working on it, the degree possible. Labor should work on it, the community should work on it, so that you're not in the horrendous situation of all of a sudden, pink slipping thousands and thousands of people, which, as you undoubtedly know, is currently going on all over the country. There has to be serious money put into the re-education of a lot of these people, especially engineers and some of the managers that have only managed for the military. There has to be a lot of retraining done. But I think that we will find that once the big shift of funds are made, there is both the talent and the expertise to really move it along. Now, I would like to suggest to you that I feel this deeply, Oregon has a very special role in the United States. It has long been very interesting to me the number of absolutely critical national leaders that this state has produced. I mean, Oregon isn't very big. It's not as if you're sitting there with 30 million people. You're not sitting there with 30 million people. But if you look at the quality of the congressional delegations that you have sent over the years and the kind of really creative leadership that these people have taken, I think you can feel that you have spoken through your votes to represent a lot of people, millions of people outside your own state who are not so fortunate as to live in an area that produces the kind of legislative leadership in Washington that you have done. And I feel very deeply at this point that the kind of crossroads we are at in this country can really set the agenda for the United States for the next 50 years. Countries don't come to crossroads very often. We are a big, diverse, and very complicated country. But I also feel that there is the spirit and the commitment within the United States that if our people are challenged and shown what kind of country we can really be, that we will move forward to having an economy of peace, prosperity, and to give the kind of moral guidance that we have been able to give to the world in the past. I think we will be able to again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marion Anderson. Our first question will be asked by our board host today, Mary McWilliams.
Actually, I think it's easier for us to envision where we'd like to spend the money in terms of infrastructure and education and the like than it is for us to figure out how much money we should be spending on defense. We hear proposals from the president and then a Democratic alternative. And could you help us try to put this question in context? How can we evaluate the proposals that are made? How much are we spending on GNP on defense? How much should we be? And how can we decide whether you're right? Because so that in future proposals we can have some basis for evaluating these proposals.
When General Eisenhower became president of the United States, he made a very interesting comment. He said, look, I've known all these guys, all these generals and admirals, my entire professional life. They never have enough money. It doesn't make any difference how much money they give them. It's never enough. So we will decide what the country will afford, and we will give it to them, and they can decide how logically to spend it. What he actually said was, and they can fight over it. So I go on a different supposition. I think we should first decide what we need to make the country secure, and some of the outline of what I've given you is what makes it secure economically, which seems to me the fundamental basis of national security. Then you say, okay, we don't have a big enemy anymore. We're not going to have to fight, 1.5 wars anymore for a long time. In fact, the Pentagon planning was on the basis of 2.5 wars simultaneously, a big war and 2 small wars. Now it's only down to 1.5 wars. And we certainly don't need to make any more nuclear weapons at all. So you can sort of take entire areas. Now, I depend, as I am not primarily a military expert, it's not my job, on people I respect. The Center for Defense Information in Washington is made up of retired generals and admirals and colonels and so forth, and they put out alternative military structures off and on. The Brookings Institution, one guy there named Kaufman, put out a DOD budget going down to $150 billion by the end of the decade. Kennedy's office, I understand, is coming out with one going down to about $200 billion, which is approximately actually what we have in converting the American economy. So those are. Let me make one quick announcement before I totally forget, which I will as soon as I get involved in the questions. Converting the American economy and bankrupting American cities, I passed out to you all because it's important that you're able to look at the numbers. For all of you that want to take it home, converting the American economy is $7. Bankrupting American cities is $5. If you buy both of them, they're $10. And on your way out, you can pay right up there at the door and then proceed to take them. If you make out a check, you can deduct it. tax deductible. Okay, sorry, next question.
A City Club member. Basically, you're talking about how should we spend the peace dividend. We've been funding our military spending through a huge budget deficit. Would you speak to the alternative, which is simply not running that deficit and not spending that money through the public sector?
Sure. Okay, open on page 4 of Converting the American Economy. We suggested in there a progressive tax policy to solve the deficit. The Citizens for Tax Justice is a very reputable Washington organization. It's been around a long time. And what they do is suggest a series of tax increases for foreign corporations, having a corporate alternative minimum tax, to have an alternative minimum tax for people who are struggling along on $270,000 a year or more, and so forth, and taxing foreigners 5% on their interest income, and terminating the tax deductibility of monies used to do mergers and acquisitions, which, as far as I'm concerned, would only help the American capitalist system. So what they're suggesting here is raising about $70 billion a year in taxes through making the tax system more reasonable. See, as far as I'm concerned, taxes are not per se either good or bad. It depends who's getting taxed and what you're using the money for.
Doug McCourt, Chair of the Standing...
Oh, excuse me. I better go a little further with this. If the money is only used to reduce the deficit in time of recession, it will then, of course, increase unemployment. Sorry.
That's okay. Chair of the Standing Committee on Energy and Environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I speak for both the environmentalists and the industry perspective to the degree that I can, that we applaud your efforts in what you're suggesting here. I do have some concern, however, though, that in the proposals for environmental investments, that a large portion of the money is proposed to be shifted amongst bureaucracies. And I'll give you an example. You recommend that over 1/3 of the $5 billion recommended for new spending on environmental investments is proposed for groundwater protection and correction programs administered by state agencies. Now, considering that virtually all monitoring and cleanup of groundwater that's going on today at the state level and in the national level is being paid for by the private party polluter and not by the state or the federal government, wouldn't it make more sense to either not take the money from those people in the first place and give them tax incentives for doing the job right in the first place, or maybe make the Army Corps of Engineers force them by law to actually help do the cleanups instead of taking a large portion of the money and just spreading it around to different bureaucracies?
I think it's important that you know that these are simply what we felt to be reasonable suggestions, partly because we wanted to be able to do an economic analysis based on shifting funds. To a large degree, any of the specific programs in here are up for precisely debate on the kind of point that you just brought up. So the answer is yes, you may be absolutely right, or you may not be. I don't know. But our primary job here was to suggest general areas of expenditure and to do an analysis showing the economic effects of them. We're not, so to speak, in love with the specific individual programs in it, per se. Yes.
Yes, I'm Gordon Schloming from the co-host institution, Lewis and Clark, and I had the benefit of reading your report, Converting the American Economy, in advance, and the question I'd like to ask is about this peace dividend. We've been talking about a peace dividend since Vietnam, maybe even since Korea, and it always seems to vanish. And indeed, some of the cuts that you recommend have already been made: withdrawal of nuclear weapons from Korea, the cancellation of MX and Midgetman, Seawolf, some carrier groups, scaled back B-2, greater troop reductions in Europe. There are perhaps even billions of dollars there. in cuts mandated by the President administration unilaterally, independent of any conversion project. But where have these savings gone?
That's
And what, I want you to speak to the political dynamics,
Right.
perhaps, about what happens when a so-called peace dividend is supposedly forthcoming and never appears.
right. That is exactly why when I was asked the question about, what should happen on different force levels, I said, start with the amount of money you want to spend, precisely for that reason. Because if you say we're going to spend 280 billion this year, 260 next, 240 the next, and by the fifth year we're going to be down to $200 billion, that puts everything in a different perspective. Otherwise, they're just going to shift the deck chairs on the Titanic and say we're not going to put all that money into the B-1, we're going to put it into Star Wars, or we're going to send a mission to Mars or whatever. I mean, name your own boondoggle. And that's precisely why. I think at this point I'm a lot more encouraged about having a peace dividend, which one congressman has actually said we should start calling a victory dividend, partly because there is simply such growing realization in the country of the terrible shape we're in. I mean, when you get major corporations like Southern Bell saying 8 out of 10 of the people applying for jobs, and this is at Bell, how high skilled are a lot of Bell jobs, and they can't hire the people. And you hear this from industry after industry, or business after business, that they're not getting the kinds of trained people they need to compete. The people can't, they don't know enough about computers, they can't read, they can't formulate things. I mean, I know a lot of lawyers, and one after another say to me, when we take on young lawyers, they can't write. They're smart, they can think, but they can't write. What the hell is preparing cases? And this is, after all, supposed to be the creme de la creme of the society. People are going all the way through college and graduate school. So I think that the pressures are now really built up. They're really built up from a lot of different areas, and that's a big help. I mean, one of the things, obviously the reasons that we do this type of analysis is so people can look at their own industry. For instance, the lumber industry or, whatever, education, and see what they could get from it. I mean, I've waited a long, long time in my life to have I've forgotten the exact name. It's basically the Road Builders Association, but that's not precisely their name. Start talking about military spending should go down so we could build more roads. Now, I personally think there should be other things done with a lot of money besides build more roads, but I'm happy to have allies like that. We got a lot more allies than we used to. And the mayors are desperate. They are really desperate. I don't know how, Portland seems a lot. I walked around last night in an area of, I don't know the city, so before I started walking around, I asked people, should I walk around? And people looked at me like, yeah, of course. What's your problem? Well, if you're in Detroit, you don't walk down the end of the block. Yeah.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. Ms. Anderson, the new Federal Surface Transportation Act that passed last year, called ICE-T, has begun to redress serious imbalances. There's more money for public transit, and there's an amount of flexibility in whether you choose highways or transit or alternatives and so on. However, it was notably silent and neglectful of the railroads. I noticed that in your proposals, you suggest about $1 billion per year for Amtrak, which is very, very appropriate and long overdue. Mm-hmm. But even in your proposals, I don't see anything suggested for the rebuilding of our freight railroads, mm-hmm. which have been subjected to serious unfair competition right. by the overwhelming assistance to the other modes.
Right.
What do you think could be done to rebuild our freight railroads and make us more competitive in the world where many are doing that?
Right. Well, obviously lobbying is one of them. If people want money to go into an area of the society, you contact the American Association of Railroads. That's approximately their name. I think it's their name. And they have been pushing for some money to rebuild. I'm not an expert on railroad rates and precisely how that would go. But, I mean, from all the reading I've done over the years, it's very clear that if you put either people or goods on railroads, you can move them both more inexpensively per passenger mile and far, far less degradation to the environment. I mean, very often, and I run around the country quite a bit speaking and so forth, I don't like to have to fly everywhere. It's ridiculous. I mean, for one thing, you don't see the country. I mean, that's just a personal thing. But I mean, very often, if they had any kind of decent, or even any rail transportation, I would take it. And what you're saying about freight is certainly absolutely true. I mean, one of the things that Senator Moynihan has really pressed for is putting money into rail and also high-speed rail, which isn't what you were talking about, but at least starts moving money in the right direction.
I think one of the problems is that it's in a different committee. It's not in public works, it's in energy and commerce. And so here public works produced this beautiful act, but couldn't address the railroads because they were in another committee.
Okay, yeah.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. Two-part question. The first is, how do we get the word out to these organizations so that they start lobbying for these changes? And secondly, a broader question, do you have a vision of what sort of country this might be 5 or 10 years down the pike if we succeeded in getting the word out and making these things happen?
Yeah, I think at this point I do. I mean, it took a couple years and a little sabbatical, my first in my working life, to have it. I think a very fundamental thing that we will have if we start making this transition is I think the country will start having hope again. I think there are a lot of people in this country without a lot of hope anymore. I was speaking this morning at a breakfast for supporters of Elizabeth First, and one of the people who's running for Congress, and one of the people afterwards said she thinks there's a kind of subclinical depression on the part of a lot of Americans. And I think one of the things that you really have when you start redirecting national priorities, and it's a kind of general term, but what you're really saying, where you really could start saying to a lot of the people in this country, there's something you can do to build the country and be patriotic that has nothing to do with death. It has to do with life. You're going to educate people. You're going to heal people. You're going to build roads and bridges. You're going to make your communities more attractive. And my feeling is that Americans are fundamentally optimistic people, and they want to be optimistic, even if for a long time they have become somewhat less optimistic. And this won't be just the sort of Morning in America ads. This will be real. You really will be doing the stuff. I think Americans are fundamentally practical. I think they understand in their guts, even if they don't think about it on a day-to-day basis, where their money is going, where their talents are going, where their energies are going. And I think if you start challenging both, the people in the organizations that you all are involved with and young people in high school, in college, and so forth, I think then you get a whole sort of spiritual transformation. People want to identify with their country. I was one of the people that spent a long time working against the Vietnam War, and my husband's family are very conservative people from northern Michigan, and my mother-in-law kept looking at me, and she's a really kind, lovely lady. It was really hard for her, but she'd look at me reproachfully and sort of start saying to me that her mother was very patriotic. I was very patriotic. I felt I was very patriotic. I've always felt I'm very patriotic. That's why I worked so hard on this stuff. And I think you can show that to people. I think you can become a much better democracy. You can't have much of a democracy with an enormous secret agenda. Then you end up with these ridiculous situations that you did when Gates was getting, confirmed for the CIA. The guy has lied in public, he has perjured himself, all kinds of stuff, and he still goes through. I mean, Is that the example we want to set to our children?
The one part
But,
of
excuse
my
me, but my
question,
point is that when you move away from the national security state, you don't have to have all this stuff anymore. There's no big security blanket anymore that these people can wrap themselves around with.
but how do we get the word out to the organizations that need to be in there lobbying for better schools, better roads, better education, and so on?
You got these two reports. Use them. The numbers are there. No, it means something. Because what you can say to these people is not just you need it to rebuild the country, and it's good for the economy. And it's especially good for the economy of Oregon. And it will be true. So you can take any group you want. You can take business people, you can take educators, you can take librarians, you can take people in the lumber trade, you can take exporters and importers. It's there.
Hi, Paul Milius, club member. How do you envision this transition taking place? It's simplistic to say all of a sudden we'll come up with 500,000 more jobs. There's certainly going to be lag time, lead time, transition time. How do we keep people supported, if not employed, in this transition and keep it from resulting in even deeper depression while we get out of the trough we're in?
Right, right. Well, that's a very good question. That's, of course, the basic aspect of conversion planning. You can do a series of things. For the people who have served in the military or who have been laid off from military industry, you can offer them support payments, say, and you can pick a number. We used, just for rule of thumb in here, it was something like 90% of the first $20,000 and 50% of the next $5,000 or something like that. So they have support payments while they go to school, if they go back for retraining, or if they go to college. So you can have at least 1 year of that, and I think for many people, especially engineers and many managers, they're going to need 2 years of that. So that's a specific support payment during a period of retraining. People getting out of the Army, a great many of them have bought into the Sonny Montgomery bill, which means they will get out of the Army with about the Armed Forces with about $10,000 that they'll simply have $10,000 given to them. So they can spend that, for instance, on training, or they can't obviously go to very expensive schools, but a lot of them could go to state schools with that. But that could be expanded. I think people should be given a lot of counseling, a lot of career counseling, and all the retraining that they need. Now, a major reason, you see, why we discussed in Converting the American Economy a shift of money rather than what this gentleman mentioned, which was simply cutting the military budget and putting it all basically into deficit reduction, is then obviously it would turn what is a fairly serious recession even into a worse recession, or even worse, depending on how much was cut. So if you, at the same time, start spending the money in other very viable areas, like infrastructure and education, which hires people fast and has a very substantial multiplier effect, then you are generating jobs at the same time that you're cutting jobs and giving other people retraining. I'm not going to say to you in a society this big that there's going to be there's not going to be any problems for any people on the individual level, but I do think that with decent legislation and advanced planning, it can be dramatically minimized.
Sorry, our time has expired. Yes,
Can I
please.
just mention one thing? For those of you that want to use any of our numbers in here in speaking engagements of your own, or television or radio, or whatever, you can consider me a sort of permanent on-call consultant. Our address and phone number is on the inside of the front cover. And unless I'm on the road and hard to reach, I am available at any time to answer questions. So don't feel that just because you've left here and have one of these that you can't call. Call any time that you need it. Pleasure being with you all.
Thank you very much, Marion Anderson. Very good.